Yeah. Hey, so good morning, everybody, and good morning, people out there online. If anybody's out there online, this is an experiment. For the first time, we are broadcasting the Daily Tck meeting. We don't necessarily expect a massive audience out there, but this is a test for Paris, because in Paris, we hope to connect the Daily Tck meetings inside the negotiations with the place to be, where we will have a crowd of content producers, bloggers, and digital campaigners sitting together who might want to appreciate a daily take on what's going on in the negotiations, from inside the COP. So very much a test. And while it feels perhaps a little bit strange to give an update to you guys who are probably all well updated from your meetings over the weekend, I shall try anyway, and perhaps keep it to the essentials today. Hoping that tomorrow we have the younger crowd in the room who usually benefit from these briefings and then contribute to our discussions about interventions and communicating the issues at hand. Obviously, nice to welcome new climate trackers. Hi. And I don't know who of you is how experienced, but perhaps these sort of briefings and updates are useful. And if I sound like I'm giving a speech, then I sort of do that because I feel like I'm talking into this machine to any potential audience out there. Normally, I think this would be slightly more conversational. I'll just tell you a little bit about what I think we know going into this weekend, what is important this week, what is important considering, in the wider context. And then I have a few updates from this morning's PCG meeting. PCG is the CAN Political Coordination Group, where many of the NGO advocates are coming together on a daily basis, who are tracking these negotiations and busy with lobbying and advocacy work with the negotiators in the hallways. And they are usually a good group to pick up on any intelligence on what's going on. But given that today is the first day, obviously this intelligence is still rather limited. Only those who attended pre-meetings by the different negotiating blocks or bumped into negotiators in restaurants last night would have had any information this morning. But there was a little bit. Maybe I'll start with a sort of first bigger picture piece for orientation, and then I'm happy to hear other inputs from other people. I'll only offer some top lines. Maybe people want to complete the picture I'm trying to paint here. I think we are going into this Bonn meeting, the last session before Paris, and therefore going into this home stretch to Paris in a very interesting situation, which differs significantly from, for example, the last Bonn session. Since then, a lot has happened. We've had an interesting week in New York with the SDGs agreed, with heads of states re-engaging with the climate issue in a Ban Ki-moon lunch. We had the sort of second installment of the US-China agreement. And all of these developments, I think, pointed to a lot of political momentum, where it's probably fair to say that heads of states are engaging in the issue and actually projecting more ambition into these talks than we currently see in draft text. There is still a kind of disconnect, I think, between what is happening in these hallways and what is reflected in draft texts and what heads of states seem to be comfortable supporting. Of course, not all 192 heads of states, not all of them engaged in New York, but 40 or 50 for many of the relevant countries did. I think this political momentum is to a good extent actually fueled by momentum created elsewhere. On the streets, mobilization activists, I think the community is out in force and very active at the moment, which helps to show how climate change is a public issue, a public concern. And I think opinion research from country to country supports this view. But it's not just activists, obviously, it's also more and more normal average citizens. And then it's scientists who are explaining the urgency to us. Good morning, please join us. Hi guys, coming from the Yango meeting, right? All right, so for anybody out there, we are welcoming more guests. I'm just giving a summary of where we are at as we are starting into these Bonn talks. So political momentum fueled by public pressure, I think, but not just from activists, but also scientists who keep repeating the urgency, businesses who are out in force with business statements, with very strong decisions to change business models or make certain investments, investor and finance voices who are either announcing that they are shifting their own investments, or who are talking about the risks of not shifting these investments. I think we have moral voices, church faith leaders. We've heard from the medical profession. Doctors have spoken out in statements to warn about the health risks of climate change and the carbon economy. So because of all these voices and more, we have a lot of sort of momentum and support for action across sectors, which fuels the political momentum. And I think, while it's far too early to tell a success story, this political momentum goes beyond rhetoric now. I think we are seeing some impact that can be counted or will be able to be counted in terms of emission reductions, in terms of real change in the real economy, etc. More than 150 countries have now submitted their INDCs, their National Climate Action Plans. And one thing we see from these INDCs is how they are bending the global warming curve. Before we had these INDCs, we were headed for something between 3 and 4 degrees of global warming, depending on which analysis you looked at. And now we are hearing that because of these INDCs, we are in for 2.7 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. So that's obviously still a fair amount above the 2 degrees that are internationally agreed and sort of seen as a danger threshold, but we're coming closer. We are bending the curve. So in the bad news of insufficiency of these INDCs is the good news that they do have the power to bend the curve. And that bodes well for follow-up actions that could increase the ambition further. A second thing that is important to be said about the INDCs is their transformative nature. I've seen initial analysis, which I think will be sort of distributed around soon, which talks about the impact that some country decisions on renewables could have for the global renewables industry and market. So with only China's and India's renewables pledges in their INDCs, we will see an adding of renewables capacity worldwide, which is twice the amount of what is currently out there worldwide. So I think we have something like 400 or close to 500 gigawatts of renewables worldwide now. And with China and India alone, we will be adding twice that, 1,000 gigawatt almost, by 2030. And if you imagine, like, that's a tripling then, right, of global capacity. If you imagine a tripling of global capacity, then this will have massive implications on the sector. Prices will go down again. I think we can see from the past how growing the renewable sector by 20% or something like this would have then reduced the costs of solar panels, etc., by X amount. So this is then, as the IEA puts it, going into some kind of spiral of positive escalation, I guess. More renewables means they will be cheaper, which means, again, more renewables in following decades. And at some stage, maybe becoming this thing that is an absolute no-brainer and where nobody would even consider fossil fuel alternatives anymore because they are just so expensive. The last and third thing that is maybe worth saying about these INDCs that are now in is about the co-benefits. There are assessments out there which talk about what these INDCs already do now, even the weak ones from countries that haven't shown much ambition. They already create thousands of new jobs in renewables. They already have the power to save lots of premature deaths from reduced air pollution. And they have the power to save billions in spending that countries would otherwise have made on fossil fuel imports from abroad. So instead of buying fossil fuels from abroad, they would rely on domestic renewables. So you have these three positive impacts of the INDCs: bending the warming curve, transformative power on certain markets, and the co-benefits country by country. But of course, we are not quite there yet. They are not strong enough to get us below 2 degrees. And I think an important thing to raise is the fairness or equity angle in them. We've seen an assessment by NGOs here on Saturday, I think, in a whole day event engaging negotiators, which showed how the developed country INDCs on average do not deliver the fair share of what these countries would have to deliver by some fairness formula that some clever people have calculated, whereas some of the developing country INDCs actually live up to this fairness formula. So I think in terms of ambition and fairness, there's still room for improvement, but we see a lot of positive impact from these INDCs already. The insufficient element there points towards the key elements in the text that need to be secured and strengthened here in these negotiations. Most importantly, probably a long-term goal that points to complete decarbonization by a fossil fuel for a fossil fuel phase out, ideally by mid-century or later, and then a phase in of 100% renewables. This coupled ideally with an agreement that countries would review their pledges or their INDCs every 5 years, and ideally not just review them to see how they are doing, doing fine, not doing fine, but strengthen them actually. So an obligation to ratchet up, to strengthen and accelerate the ambition every 5 years. I think that's the fight now in these talks and in Paris, making some of these elements in the text as strong as possible so that living with decent but not strong enough INDCs is an actual option. If we don't get long-term goal and ratchet, then the weak INDCs are a real problem. But with a long-term goal and a ratchet, the weak INDCs are actually something we can perhaps build on in confidence, or with confidence. I think, a couple more things for context before I tell you a little bit about what I heard this morning. I think it's obviously also totally worth taking into account that there are big changes happening in the real world that are not necessarily reflected at all in negotiating texts here. Not just the boom of the renewables, but obviously also the trouble that the fossil fuel sector is in. I think we have now seen a few months really of almost daily headlines somewhere in the world about the terminal decline of the coal sector. Of course, you can argue that there are still countries in the world where coal is going very strong, but I think it's increasingly limited to parts of booming Southeast Asia, for example, and a few other spaces in the world. But the outlook, the ratings, the recommendations for investments that banks and analysts, etc., are making are strongly negative across the board. One bank after another, one analyst after another is coming out with warnings about the financial challenges that this sector is facing. We see many companies in the coal sector filing for bankruptcy. We see stock values plummeting. Like look at Peabody, who are now, I think, I don't know, like at $1 or something like this. And then we actually see, like these companies really closing down, and that leading to loads of people losing their jobs. In China, one of the state mining companies apparently sacked 100,000 people, as you saw in the news about a couple of weeks ago, which then again points to the importance for the so-called just transition, which is this transition where we orderly manage the shift from fossil fuels to renewables and find a way to take these workers along the journey rather than creating a chaos in our societies and in the markets, because what else is it when 100,000 people lose their jobs and there's no way forward for them? So I think the just transition becoming a very urgent thing now if these companies collapse and if loads of people lose their jobs, which is a good thing in terms of emissions, but probably a bad thing in terms of the jobs. So we need to give these people work. A last context piece that I would like to mention, because it's in the news today. Obviously, climate change isn't waiting for any of this. It's happening, even at 1 degree of global warming or 0.8 or 0.9. You've all probably seen about the storm in the Philippines. Luckily, it seems like it didn't have the devastating power of the last big one last year, where 6,500 people or 7,000 people died. It seems like so far casualties are low, but tens of thousands displaced who had to run away from the storm and seek security somewhere. I think it's lingering over the country and resulting in massive rainfall, as it seems. And as a result of that, it is well possible that over the next 3 or 4 days, we hear about more casualties as a result of this storm, but hopefully not thousands. Still, it reminds us how climate change is fueling these extreme weather events, making these storms stronger through hotter oceans and thereby more destructive and more deadly. And I think this is, as always, an important reminder that we can't rest on INDCs that are bending the curve to 2.7 or might have transformative impacts. We need faster and deeper cuts in emissions whenever we can get them. Maybe that takes us to Bonn and to the text, in which a few things could go right or could go wrong and could take us in the right direction on this journey. And I think, as you probably all have heard about the weekend, nobody really loved this new text. And that is not surprising. I think the co-chairs have taken a text that was much longer than what is on the table. Now it's limited down to about 20 pages. And as a result of that, obviously, all sorts of elements have disappeared that countries hold dearly and care about a lot. And it's then unsurprising that they are protesting and demand a chance to get their pet issues or their priorities back in. I think this is what has sort of happened over the weekend, in that the co-chairs have consulted with all these parties and negotiating blocks and have heard this strong message that the text as it stands is essentially not acceptable, and that they demand an option to put stuff back into this text. It sounds like the text has been rejected, but if you think about it, it hasn't, and that's probably the good news in what sounds scary on first look. I think if it would have been rejected completely, then we wouldn't be working on opening up this text now and adding stuff to it. Then we would probably go back to an old text from the Geneva session in February, which was 80 pages long and unwieldy. So I think the good news in this is that the text is apparently the text going forward. However, it may not stay at 20 pages. I think the most optimistic people, good colleagues at WRI, have done an exercise where they have tried to be as precise as possible in adding elements to the text that most countries and parties care about, and that expanded it by only 2 or 3 pages, if you are precise and short in doing this. So expanding a text from 20 to 23 pages doesn't sound so horrible, right? But then intelligence this morning suggested that the G77, who were the most vocal last night in pushing for the reopening of the text and demanding that they could add stuff back in, have suggested 8 pages to be added on adaptation only, for example. So somebody had seen an adaptation element that would be added back in that was 8 pages long. So you can imagine if sort of, say there is a 10 pages mitigation component, an 8 pages adaptation component, a 5 pages loss and damage component, and a 12 pages finance component or something like this, then this text will obviously, mushroom quickly back to the size or the length that we've been dealing with before. And this is only G77, and you would have contributions from other parties as well. So what is happening down there now in the opening plenary and in the following sessions will be very interesting to watch. Is this text going to balloon again? And are we facing a sort of crisis coming out of Bonn with a massive and bad text that will make it hard to come to conclusions in Paris on a strong and clear deal? Or will the governments here actually do what the co-chairs suggested in their note yesterday, make surgical contributions, keep it short, accept that they are limited to only the most important red flag issues that can't be missing from their perspective? I think if that's what the parties do, then maybe this process can lead to something useful. There are interesting views and discussions about the strategy that the co-chairs might be following with this approach. Because some people were like, oh, this is scary, and what is this all about? Some people suggested that this is deliberate. The long text before was unmanageable and couldn't move forward. Slimming down to 20 pages would of course get everybody upset, as we have seen over the weekend, but could be a conscious move, which essentially then forces everybody to really zoom in on the essentials as they sort of use their limited right to get stuff back in. So rather than cutting it down to 50 pages, for example, and trying to create some sort of rich compromise text that could work for everybody, they have apparently decided to cut it down to 20, a text that probably doesn't work for anybody really, and then see how they can maintain a certain limit on contributions that are added back in so that the text remains manageable. Because if they would have gone for 50 and people would have added 30 pages, we would have been back to a big text. This could be the strategy that they're following. I don't think anybody really knows for sure. I've just met somebody from the UNFCCC Secretariat on the corridors who confirmed that this is maybe what's going on and that they're all quite confident about that this process is making sense, and who also emphasized that the important bit here is ownership. The parties need to have ownership of the text. If it's a text that somehow is an alien text coming from the outside, that none of them really own or feel to have buy-in for, then they would reject it more easily and not engage with it. So this process of reopening it and having parties add stuff back in is also a way to give them ownership and allow them to feel that this is theirs rather than somebody else's. The NGOs were discussing this morning that it obviously is important now to watch this, and that we should probably not be too hung up on process questions, but that we should zoom in laser sharp on the content questions, because this is now the moment where also those who are advocating for certain things can get that stuff fine-tuned in the right way or added back in the right way. That would take you to the key issues in the text, and I don't want to go through those because that would take too much time now. Happy to have a discussion if you guys like, but stuff like the long-term goal, stuff like the ratchet mechanism, stuff like the finance language, adaptation goal, and loss and damage, if I would have to name 5 priority areas, are all in need of strengthening from the NGO perspective or from the perspective of those progressive advocates. And this is now a chance to do this. There was very little intelligence in the meetings this morning about who was preparing what kind of language to go back in. So on mitigation or finance or loss and damage, nobody knew anything about parties currently drafting new inputs. The only thing we've heard about over the weekend is the Africa proposal on adaptation. So probably Africa is putting forward something on adaptation with G77 support. Maybe that's the 8 pages that we've heard about. And then somebody suggested that on finance, we should probably look at an old submission from the G77 from the last Bonn session, which they made at the end of that session or towards the end of that session, and which apparently isn't reflected at all in this 20-page draft now. So the G77 are seen to be likely to go back to that old submission from the last session and to say, look, you apparently ignored this completely. Take at least these essentials from it or something. So those are the 2 only indications on what kind of text might come now and where it might come from. But surely there'll be more than this. Nobody had intelligence what it would be and where it's from. The NGOs also discussed who is championing stuff now and who is blocking stuff. There was an attempt to sort of figure out if we can talk about this already in public, to describe to journalists something about dynamics between countries. However, this was seen as difficult because it's all happening still behind closed doors. There's very little out in public in terms of anybody blocking or championing stuff. And so nobody felt very comfortable on naming and shaming anybody at this stage. I think we need to look at these first couple of days here in Bonn to see who comes out publicly on what. But of course, we can see a few things. For example, apparently, Japan has apparently made comments about loss and damage language and finance language in closed-door meetings that were not seen to be helpful. Apparently, the EU and the UK were nervous about sort of adding certain new kinds of language on the finance text, but don't ask me for the details. So behind closed doors, these kinds of things are happening, but it's not out in the open yet, and therefore it's sort of hard to comment on it publicly. But I guess the country positions are shaping up behind the scenes, and we will see this surface in one way or another sooner or later. One specific thing was mentioned. Strikingly, the OPEC countries, all of them or most of them, so the oil-producing countries, have not submitted INDCs yet. So Saudi Arabia and many of the Emirates, etc.
Nigeria included.
Yeah, and people suggested that it would be important to put pressure on these countries to come forward. They have missed the UNFCCC deadline. They're giving themselves new deadlines on a regular basis. Currently, they are apparently saying 1st of November. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries can do with pressure on submitting INDCs and showing how they are contributing to the shift away from fossil fuels to a future powered by renewable energies, if anybody wants to pick up on this in their publishing. I would like to close with a quick take on media coverage. Thanks to colleagues actually here in the room. We have lovely media overviews in the morning. So for those who have not seen those or are not getting those, it seems like there's actually a significant amount of media coverage. So this Bonn session is not totally under the radar compared to perhaps previous sessions, which is an important thing to take note of. Last one before Paris, so unsurprisingly, media is taking notice. And it seemed like almost all of the coverage, at least in the analysis that I saw, is focused actually on these dynamics around this 20-page text, what parties are making of it, why they might not like it or reject it, and what the way forward is. So I think it's a lot of process-oriented coverage, and while the European and American outlets take a more sober and neutral analytical stand on it, it seems like especially the Indian coverage is very sort of charged and emotional, but we've seen this in the past with some journalists there who like to choose a language that makes it sound all very dramatic and on the knife's edge and like a big fight brewing out there. I guess out there down in the plenary, if we would sit there now, we would know how much of a storm it is. With that, I'll end, and I'll suggest that what I didn't cover, so a detailed take on the 5 or 6 or 7 key elements in the text, is something we could look at tomorrow by inviting a guest, like we have done in previous sessions, who would go through a bit of a Q&A with us, hopefully also with a bigger audience to benefit from such a session and Q&A. Always a problem on the first day that people need to find their ways and their schedules and their daily routines. So hopefully we have a bigger crowd online and in the room tomorrow and can have a guest here. Chris and I have already reached out to a few people who would talk us through the key elements in the text and maybe what we think the dynamics are around those, which parties are pushing or blocking, or what else we can say about these. That would be a suggestion for tomorrow. And apart from that, we would do the regular update, but much briefer than today. Today, I wanted to give you a big contextualizer. So update for PCG, brief, a guest to talk us through the key issues in the text in a bit more detail, and then maybe using any time that remains to share updates and views on actions and interventions that anybody might be planning, as well as communications take on the situation. So if you're publishing on this, what may you be writing? Is there anything that people can share that might help with shaping frames and narratives? That's the end of today's update and a suggestion for tomorrow. I don't know, Chris, can I sort of hand it to you to take it from somewhere to somewhere?
I thought you would never ask, to be honest. That was a wonderful update, but I was eagerly awaiting to jump in and steal the show from Christian. He's had much too much of the limelight, and I'm too much of an egotistic maniac to ever let anyone have more than 15 minutes without myself intervening. So let's we've got some wise heads in the room. Obviously you can't see them at the moment for security reasons, but we do have some very intelligent people in the room, and I'm going to pass it around. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it, and I'll just repeat some of the things, but let's kind of start talking about today. Does anyone have any kind of expectations or critical updates that Christian missed out on that we might want to share with, I guess, the rest of the team or those viewers online? So what you can't see is there's a few huddles right now. Strategic thinkers are getting together what they want to say first, and we're just kind of waiting to get their updates first. But let's head to the GSCC team. What's the GSCC team expecting this week?
So we were mostly working on stuff like this outside today we felt to follow up with the White House business initiative that was first announced a month or so ago, and was made that the US countries would be
Yeah. All right. Can we put the Yango friends on the spot and ask if there are any interesting things you might want to share from your first morning meeting? Are there plans emerging for activities to do this week, or other updates on priorities? Does one of you want to share that?
But as we do as the third, it would like to shoot at the extra intellectual activity and provide them with so they're going to push it to have to very
I think we are trying to take the webcast into the room. Let's see how that goes. Sounds good. Is there anything sort of you can, I know it's not decided and only initial ideas and stuff like this, but is anything emerging that you could hint at? For example, I know that on Thursday, apparently there are plans to put some pressure on Japan regarding export credit agency funding on coal projects. I believe maybe some people in the Yango department are involved in these conversations. Is that something that's taking shape? And are there other things you can at least already hint at, or is it too premature?
So I don't know all of this for now, but
Okay.
have this information.
Nope. All right. Okay. Maybe we'll get more tomorrow. Chris, do you want to take it to the climate tracker and see if we can get an update there from one of our colleagues on priorities and activities for the week?
All right. Hello. Well, as climate trackers, we basically just track negotiations, try to write about it, and try to push our politicians in directions we like them to push. So kind of what I personally still try to figure out is in which direction these things are actually moving, like what's going on with the text and which countries are maybe those which will be important to write about or to talk to. But what's for me as someone from Germany especially, it's interesting what's going to be the role of the European Union, but also what kind of country are maybe responsible for making the text longer than needed and holding negotiations back basically, and then reporting about that. But I think there's a lot of things we still will see today, and I'm still kind of in a phase of figuring out what's exactly going on, and that's my task for today, and then I'm gonna try to write about this.
So I think with that short round of updates, we sort of, I think, come to the conclusion that it's a Bonn meeting which is sort of starting with a lot of sort of uncertainty and questions about a text and what parties are going to do with it. I'm not sure there's much more point in discussing interventions, actions, activities, or framings and narratives at this stage. I hope with my sort of big input at the beginning, I've sort of sent us off in a useful way for the week. But I guess how we then fine tune all of this will depend very much on how this morning and afternoon pan out. So I suggest we try and come back together again tomorrow in this place and take stock of what the first day did to this volatile situation and how we then would talk about it and what can be done maybe in terms of interventions and actions also, in case you want to bring that conversation here and share it with others from your Yango meeting, for example. And Chris and I will find that guest who will talk about the key elements in the text, which is something where then my detailed knowledge reaches its limits and where I think it would be good to have a good overview or expert person. So unless anybody has any additional inputs or questions, or maybe even, I don't know, how does that technical channel work, Chris? Is there anybody on that webcast who wants to come in or ask anything, or is it just a one-way channel?
So we do. We have opportunities for you to ask questions. Unfortunately, we didn't, I guess, advertise that previously. In tomorrow's webcast, if you want to ask any questions at the Daily Tck, you can tweet them to hashtag #call4climate, and you can also add them to the Daily Tck live stream as a comment. So at the moment, it doesn't seem like we have too many of those right now, but feel free for the rest of the day, if you want to add anything, you can add that to those hashtags on Twitter or to the comments page on the live stream. We'll be here again live tomorrow, same place, but probably about 15 minutes later. We'll be starting at 10:15. And we'll be giving you the update every day from now until the end of the week. We'll have a lot of more interesting and dynamic things to bring up tomorrow, where it looks like we'll have a slightly amended negotiating process, maybe a new text, maybe not. We're not sure right now, but there's certainly some fireworks going on in the opening plenary, which you can see live, that you can access through the UNFCCC site. So follow that and ask your questions to hashtag #call4climate, and we'll be addressing those tomorrow in the Daily Tck meeting.
Cool. Thank you all for coming. Awesome and strange at the same time to talk to a computer crowd, which wasn't a crowd, but also people in the room. It's so weird.